Some of you may have heard of the movie I'm referencing in the introduction. It's one I've mentioned from time to time. Of course, it's Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And in their arrival and the rescue mission to get Princess Leia from the Death Star, good old Luke opens the cell and peers in at Leia, surprised, of course, because she's good looking. He doesn't know it's his sister yet. Otherwise, these thoughts would be weird. And she says, "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?" I think that's not very nice. Apparently there's a height requirement. They can't shoot straight, but apparently you have to be 6 foot tall to be a stormtrooper. His looks were deceiving. He takes off the helmet, she sees what's going on, and then when they get out in the hall and they are running, they look down and they see the Millennium Falcon, which she thinks is a hunk of junk, and she says, "You came in that thing? You're braver than I thought." So she didn't appreciate the look of him. She didn't appreciate the look of the vessel, but looks can be deceiving. We have a number of idioms for that, right? Don't judge a book by its cover being one of the most important ones. That's actually fairly apropos for today's message, because Joseph is more than what he seems, and there's more than what's going on the surface happening in Luke chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. We begin with verse 4. It says, "So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee." So when we hear the Christmas story as it is told in Matthew and Luke, and perhaps some of John's theological wisdom melded into that, there are a number of questions that we probably have. Information that we aren't given because these are very brief narratives, right? Just a few paragraphs telling this story when it could have been page after page after page. For my money, I'd like to know more about Joseph. We just don't have much. When and why did his family move north to Nazareth in Galilee? Was the carpentry business shared by his brothers, if he had them? Was it passed down from his father Jacob? Were they a long line of carpenters, or was this, a fallback profession because something else wasn't working out? And what was it about his life up till this point that demonstrated that he was a man capable of his role, not only in Jesus' birth, which is a big role, but in his childhood? What made God think that Joseph was someone that could handle this? Ultimately, with respect to Joseph, we only have a few pieces of information to go on. We don't even know what happened to him between when he and Mary are with the 12-year-old Jesus at the temple and when Jesus begins his public ministry with the baptism by John about 18 years after that. We assume, because we don't have any other information, that in the intervening period he died. But the Gospels don't mention him again. Mary and Jesus never talk about him. Jesus never mentions him to his disciples, at least not in what is recorded. So Joseph is a bit of a mystery. But at this particular moment in time, he is a key part of God's unfolding plan. So let's continue learning about him. Where are they going from Nazareth? They're going to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David. Now, Joseph lives in Nazareth, and I showed you the pictures of Nazareth a few weeks ago from our trip to Israel. But he's on his way south to Bethlehem, and that's about a 4-day journey, depending on how much ground you cover, because it's about 90 miles of winding roads up and over the hills, on foot, of course, at least for Joseph. The journey itself would normally be unremarkable. Probably Joseph and his relatives had journeyed on these very roads on their way to Jerusalem for the festivals, for Passover and the rest of them, a number of times. So they would have known which way they're going. They would have known where to stop. They would have known all of these things. Bethlehem is only about a half dozen miles further beyond Jerusalem. Another half day. Bethlehem's claim to fame, of course, originally is the resting place of Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel. It's where her tomb is. Later, it gathered a lot more notoriety than that as the hometown of this shepherd boy who became an unlikely soldier against a giant. And then that same boy became a successful general when he grew up. Eventually, his king betrayed him, only to have the prophet anoint this young man as the next king. As far as favorite sons from a town to brag about, King David's a pretty good one for Bethlehem to take pride in. Nobody else can say, we're the hometown of David. Why is he going there? Well, because he belonged to the house and line of David. Why Bethlehem? That's where Joseph's ancestors had called home. Now, at some point, some of them, including Joseph, had ended up in Nazareth. But home was still Bethlehem. In fact, Joseph's family could trace their way back all the way to the legendary King David himself. It had been about 1,000 years since David lived and reigned in Jerusalem. So by now there were quite a decent number of people who could trace their ancestry back and claim David as a great, however many they needed to go, grandfather. Joseph was one of them. Any idea who your ancestor was 1,000 years ago? No, probably not, right? Not the kind of thing we keep track of. They absolutely knew that sort of thing, and Joseph could trace it back. Now, to have that heritage, that would be special. But the throne had been vacant for nearly 600 years. That's a while. And Joseph is just a carpenter living in the north. Now, being a descendant of David is no doubt an honor for Joseph and his family. But in the real world, where Rome reigns supreme and Herod is their puppet king, doesn't seem likely to make any practical difference in his life. Why is he going there? He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him. We're not sure how old Joseph is at this point. Some of the art portrays him as a fairly young man. Some of it portrays him as an old man. We absolutely have no idea. Part of that is because Jesus' brothers, we don't know if they're his half-brothers from a previous marriage or his half-brothers from Joseph and Mary or a bit of both. We have no idea, so we don't know how old he was. But we at least know that he was well enough established in his carpentry business that Mary's father considered him to be a suitable match. He's not going to marry his daughter to a man who can't provide for her, so he's at least that old. For Jews in the ancient world, the period of engagement was legally binding, and that's something, of course, that we don't have as our custom. You can break off a marriage, runaway bride kind of thing on the day of, and there's no legal repercussions. We're reminded of that fact in Matthew's narrative, as we read this morning, when Joseph considered divorcing Mary, and it would have been considered a divorce. He wanted to do so quietly upon learning of her pregnancy because he was a kind man. At that point, he thought she had cheated on him. Of course, he learns better. Now, this betrothal would have been one arranged by Joseph's and Mary's parents. It would have been finalized by a marriage at some point. Who knows how far along in that process of betrothal they were, when Joseph came ceremonially to Mary's house to get her and take her back to his house for the marriage celebration. And there she would live at his family's, probably a multi-generation family home. That plan was interrupted in a big way because this happened. She was expecting a child. Now, let's be honest, it wouldn't have been unheard of for a betrothed bride to become pregnant thanks to her soon-to-be husband. We can imagine these things happened. Although, to varying degrees, it would have been scandalous depending on the culture. Joseph, however, knew that he had nothing to do with this baby's existence. If not for his angelic visitation while he slept, he would have rejected Mary, assuming her to be unfaithful to him. But now, however, Joseph has decided, based upon what he learned from the angel, to move ahead with marriage to Mary. Our assumption is that most people would have assumed, oh, that Joseph, and they got married real quick and all that kind of thing, shotgun wedding kind of thing. Who knows how many people they told the truth to through the years. The pregnancy was a wrench in the works. But now Joseph knows that this is the will of God at work. In addition to the surprise pregnancy, Mary and Joseph now have come to Bethlehem so that Joseph can register with the Roman authorities to pay his taxes. Nothing says welcome to parenthood like some new taxes to pay. That is a real treat. Too bad they didn't have the child tax deduction in those days, right? If the date of December 25th is accurate, they could have claimed Jesus for that whole year. But unfortunately, the Romans didn't believe in child tax deductions as far as I'm aware. So yeah, that's going to be fun. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. We don't know how long they were there. We don't know how long they had to stay, but the baby came. We think Mary rode a donkey. That would have been normal, especially during a pregnancy, with her child's arrival not that far away, a few months at most probably when they set out. Once they arrived in Bethlehem, that time came to be. The baby was coming. The circumstances were far from ideal. That support network of family and friends is not here, or at least not in the way that it would normally be, not to mention that they're not at their home back in Nazareth. But Bethlehem has something going for it that Nazareth just doesn't. Symbolism, right? What do people think of Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? What do they think of Bethlehem? They think of something else. Bethlehem was the place where the prophets of old, Micah in particular, had foreseen the coming of the Messiah. It was no coincidence that Joseph was an heir to David and that he was here in Bethlehem with his wife about to give birth. God brought these two here to this place for this moment. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. Mary and Joseph were not surprised their firstborn was a son. Both had been told in their separate angelic visitations that the child conceived by the Holy Spirit would be called Jesus, an ominous name meaning the Lord saves, that pointed to what his future would hold. She gave birth. I find that to be interesting. That's a fairly understated way of describing not only the miracle of birth, right? It is indeed a miracle, and of course the ordeal that women go through to bring it about. She gave birth. Fairly low-key explanation for that. But of course, this is more than just she gave birth, because this is also the arrival of God in the flesh. This is Emmanuel, God with us. And all we get is she gave birth. Countless children have come into the world in this same way, before and since, but this was the only one who was and is the Son of God, eternal and divine. The only one arrived with the power to change the world forever. And so she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. And this is how such a child arrived. In a building built to house animals, not a house. In a town with symbolic value, but not the one that the child would grow up in. To a set of parents who knew he would grow up to be the anointed one of God, but for now had all the same issues of sleepless nights that all new parents must navigate lying ahead of them. So now we have seen the great prophet, the ultimate high priest, the mighty king, and he has arrived here in Bethlehem in humble circumstances with massive expectations. 3 things to remember from the birth narrative. Number 1, God chose Joseph and brought him to Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecies that the Messiah would be the heir of David. Secondly, Mary's unexpected pregnancy with its unique circumstances built on this messianic fervor. It built that expectation up. And then thirdly, while greatness in his future was assured, Jesus came into this world humbly.